The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Welcome to unit number 5. And I just want to do a quick sound check if I may. Could I ask you please if you could just go to the question box and just type in the word clear. All good, thanks Vanessa. Thanks Toby. Thanks John. Thanks Mark. Good, excellent. Coming across loud and clear, which is great. Now, you'll get the slides, of course, you'll get the recording, the normal sort of process that we go through here. So you'll receive them, maybe not this afternoon, but certainly in the next day or two. So we had a great session, and I had some good feedback from having Chris Burton on the show last time, if I could call it that. And Chris gave a great overview of team roles, and I hope it gave you another lens to look at your team and to consider how your team's performing and thinking about it from the point of view of how they like to contribute in terms of their own work preferences. So that was very useful. And today we're going to talk about team conflict, and let's be straight about it. Obviously, there's going to be conflict at different times in teams, and that's to be expected. The question, of course, is what do you as a team leader do in those sort of circumstances, and how do you actually manage that? And what's your actual influence, what's your actual negotiation and conflict style? So all of those things are going to be covered today. So if you've got questions or comments or observations, you just go to where you put in the word clear over in the question box there, and please don't hesitate to do that at any time during the broadcast, because what I'll do is, of course, deal with that as soon as I see it, bearing in mind, of course, I'm the only one that gets to see it, and of course I will address it to the total group. All right, so you might think, well, why have I included team conflict and negotiations in the title? Well, any negotiation is actually a form of conflict, because obviously if you didn't have to negotiate, you wouldn't, there would be an agreement of minds. So wherever there's a difference of viewpoint is what I would refer to or define as conflict. And of course, negotiation is exactly that. All right, so let's have a look at what we're covering today. But just before I do that, let's just quick recap of where we've been and where we're going. So we looked at the characteristics of high-performing teams. We looked at the 4 stages of team development. We looked at tools for leading teams, the roles people play in teams. And we're now, of course, looking at managing team conflict and negotiation. And next time we meet, we're going to look at developing team culture. So just a quick overview. So let's have a look at, of course, I gave you some homework to do. I asked you to actually have a look at your team and start to observe your team. Has anyone got any interesting observations that they made in relation to their team? Just observing them the afternoon after we had our last session 2 weeks ago in terms of people's role preferences. If anyone's got any interesting insights, go for your life and let me know. But of course, as I said before in the last session, if you want to do that formally, of course, you can do the team role preference profiles, and that can be really enlightening for your team, and it can really actually give people some really good insight into how other people in the team like to operate. You don't necessarily have to do that, but if you wish to do that, of course, contact me and I can arrange that for you. So let's move on to our topic today. Now, and of course, the other thing that we talked about last time, and I just put these 2 slides up, is that the team themselves has a profile. So when you actually look at individual people's preferences, what it demonstrates to you is a profile or a personality of the team. So you can see over on the left-hand side there, you've got people's primary preference, or their major preference, we call it. And you can see that this team is a very strong team on the right-hand side. So it's very much a an assessing, an organising, a producing and inspecting team. And you can see that over on the left-hand side, it's quite light on in terms of what people's preferences are. And of course, this is distinct from their functional role. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see that people's related preferences have been included in the profile, and it rounds out the team in a better way. So, for example, one of my bits of advice to this team would be for the person who's got the initials AC. If you notice the initials AC over in the light blue area, that's the maintaining, upholding and maintaining. I'd be strongly recommending that that person be prepared when they see the opportunity to speak up on the maintaining and upholding function of the team, because obviously nobody else in the team has got a high preference for doing that. So that person gets a renewed sense of their own purpose in the team, apart from, of course, doing the job that they're required to do. And you'll notice, of course, that up in the yellow space there, although it's not really clear on the screen, you can see that there are 4 people who have related preferences in the which is at the exploring and promoting. So these are the people I would be relying on to promote what the team's doing to the rest of the organisation and other stakeholders, because they have a natural tendency to do that. It's just that they may not feel comfortable speaking up. So that's where this can become very practical and useful information. Okay, so I'm going to look at political awareness to start with, and you might think, well, why would I do that? Well, I think political awareness is important when you're dealing with conflict, and I just wanted to talk about that. A lot of people I talk to, who are team leaders, say, oh, I'm not terribly politically aware, I'm not interested in being politically aware, I'm just coming to work, I'm just doing my job and all the rest of it. But the reality is you get 2 people on a desert island and there's going to be politics. Okay, so the reality is that we live in a world where politics is playing out. And I think as a team leader, you need to understand that. I'm going to share with you the Thomas Kilmann model, and the Thomas Kilmann model is probably the best and most reputable model out there on team conflict. And it basically has 5 different ways of dealing with conflict. Then I'm going to talk about how you might use each of those in a more effective way. And I'm going to share with you some very simple case studies, and I'll get you to actually contribute and think, well, which of those 5 particular styles do you think might be the most appropriate for dealing with each of those case studies? Now, I believe I sent out to you a profile to complete. So if you've completed that profile, that's great. It'll make a lot of sense to you. You'll be able to see where you fit in. If you haven't completed the profile, just if you go back to the previous email and click on the link, you can do the profile even after this session. So we'll just see how many. In fact, might just check to see, has anyone done the profile, so I can just sort of get a sense of where people are at. So just type in over in the question box whether you've done it, and if you did do it, I'd be very interested to know which was your dominant style. So just type in over there on the question box your dominant style. And of course, if you didn't do it, you don't need to respond to that. Okay, so Martin says that his dominant style is competing. So of course, yeah, that would colour a lot of your dealing with conflict, where competing is a win-lose. So you would kind of want to win most of those particular arguments, I guess, and that would be quite important, and that would be your natural style. Of course, you don't want your natural style to be dominating, because if it's dominating too much, then you're not being flexible enough in terms of the way you're dealing with teams. And I think that's one of the big themes running through the Lunch and Learn program for you, is the need to be flexible and agile, to be able to do different things at different times when it requires that, a different approach. And sometimes we don't know and we make a mistake, and I'm hoping what the Lunch and Learn series will do is to be able to say, okay, plan A isn't working, what about plan B, or what about plan C, or whatever. Okay, let's move on. Now, in terms of this political awareness, let's talk about it. This is a great model by Badley, and it just really underpins the fact that you can be politically aware and also ethical, because a lot of people, when they think about being politically aware, they think about people being cunning and underhanded. And of course that does go on, but you can actually be ethical at the same time. So let's have a look. So you've got a continuum here. At one end, you've got game players. Now, I'm sure you know people in your organisation who are game players. They're always on the take. They're always trying to get sometimes an unfair advantage. You also know, I'm sure, and hopefully have people in your team and elsewhere who act with integrity. So that's the first continuum. Now, obviously, I'd be hoping, and you probably like to think, that you're on the right-hand side rather than the left-hand side. And then there's a vertical axis, and the vertical axis, you've got people who are politically aware, and these are people who understand politics very well and they play it very well, but they don't necessarily do it in a cunning and underhanded way. And of course, you'd know people who are politically unaware. And so, I would be hoping on this continuum, you would be at the top rather than the bottom. Now, let me just define political awareness for you, because I think some people get a very strange idea about it. In my view, political awareness is the ultimate form of empathy. What it really means is that when you do something or don't do something in the workplace, you are quite aware and attuned to the impact that that decision will make in terms of how other people might perceive it. So in other words, you take into account the actual reactions to something that you do or don't do, and that you already anticipate and reasonably accurately anticipate the way people might react to that. So what we have here is 4 quadrants, and we've been using 4 quadrants quite a lot, of course, in the Lunch and Learn. So over here in this quadrant, we have people who are what we might call clever. These are people who are politically aware, so they are quite savvy in terms of understanding how other people may react or not react to the things we do. But these people are game players. In other words, they're pretty much doing things for their own benefit rather than the benefit of the team or the organisation. And of course, you would know people who are foxes in your organisation, and you've got to be very wary of them because you know they're foxes. But because they're quite politically aware, they can tend to get away with lots of things. They say the right thing in meetings. They tend to get into the ear of the people that are critically important. So they do have a lot of influence. The only problem, of course, is that people understand that they're foxes, and that's not always a good thing, of course. And then you've got people here below the foxes who we might term as inept. So we'll call them donkeys. So the donkeys are the donkeys are game players. The only problem with donkeys, of course, is they're not very good at it. So these are people who are politically unaware. So they go around, attempting to get personal gain from all sorts of situations. But because they're politically unaware, they often get caught out. But nevertheless, they keep trying. Now, obviously, that's not a very effective place to be for a team leader, nor, I might say, is being a fox a very effective place to be either, because people who are foxes can't be trusted. And people who are inept, that is, donkeys, really don't have any real political savvy at all, and they're also not trusted. So that's not a good position to be in. So obviously the idea is to be over here on the right-hand side. So let's have a look. We've got people who are innocent, and we might call them lambs. These are people who are politically unaware, but act with integrity. So they go about their business, and they'll often make comments like, I'm not very interested in politics. I come to work I do my job to the best of my ability. I don't want to annoy people. I don't want to rock the boat. And frankly, that's all that counts for me. Now, whilst it's great that they act with integrity, if they happen to be a team leader such as you, that's not a particularly good place to be, because of course the lamb is not going to be aware of the political impact of their own decisions and what they do in the team, and that can be a problem. And of course, where we want you to be is up here in the top right hand corner. We want you to be the wise owl. The wise owl is politically aware and can act with integrity. So in other words, you can weigh up the pros and cons of a decision. You can understand how other people will be impacted by it before the impact takes hold. And perhaps you can anticipate and do something about that. That's where I think that's where you need to be. So I think if you're saying to yourself, I'm not really interested in, organizational politics, and I'm not, if you have that view, I think you're going to create problems for yourself. So the idea is you can still act with integrity, but be politically aware. But I must say that the higher up you go up the ladder, up the corporate ladder, if you like, the more difficult it is to be in that space. And it's not because you all of a sudden become crooked when you move up the ladder. It means that basically the further up you go, the more the impact of the decisions is not necessarily black and white. So that there are decisions that are made that are can affect certain people in certain ways. So the higher up you go, so when you get to the CEO level, it becomes quite problematic to be perceived as the wise owl, because the decisions can be misconstrued by other people, and of course they're far more complex. Anyway, it's worth having a think about. I just thought I'd share that with you before we got into the Thomas Kilmann model. Okay, now the Thomas Kilmann model. Now the Thomas Kilmann model is right on your screen now, and let's have a look at it and let's understand how it works. So over on the left hand side you've got assertiveness. So towards the bottom of the page is low assertion, and towards the top of the page is high assertion. What do we mean by that? This is about you asserting your rights in a conflict situation. So you'll notice that at the top there on the left hand side you've got competing. Now competing is a win-lose situation. So when you compete with someone, what you're attempting to do is to win, and it might be an argument or whatever, at the cost of the other person. Whereas of course if you look at the bottom there and you've got avoiding, so avoiding is fairly self-explanatory, you just don't engage. Now if you don't engage in a conflict situation, then obviously you're not being assertive. Now across the bottom there you'll notice cooperativeness. So over on the left-hand side is low cooperativeness. Over on the right-hand side is high cooperativeness. So when you're competing with someone, of course, whilst it's being highly assertive, it's not necessarily being very cooperative, because obviously you're trying to win your argument. And of course, if you're avoiding, you're not really being cooperative. You might be doing it for peacemaking reasons, but you're not necessarily being cooperative. And you're certainly not being assertive, and that's why avoiding is in that corner. So if you look at accommodating there, which is on the right-hand side, accommodating is the exact opposite of competing. So accommodating is where you let the other party win at your expense. And you might think, well, when would I do that? Well, if it's a small thing that needs to be if it's a small issue for them, it's a small issue for you, but it's a big issue for them, you might think about the strategy of letting them win the battle so you can win the war. So you basically concede to their needs. And so you're not acting terribly assertively, of course, because by doing so you might upset them, because it's a very important need that they have. And any of us that are in relationships that are successful would understand that we spend a lot of our time accommodating. You have to. So if you're in a personal relationship with someone, there's a time and a place, of course, for people to act assertively, and there's a time and a place for people to act in an accommodation fashion. And of course, we'd know that. Now, right up the top on the right-hand side, you've got collaborating. Now, collaborating is high on assertion and high on cooperativeness. So this is a situation where you would work with and through other people to get the job done. So this is very much working with people to come to a resolution that you're both happy with. So you'd be assertive because, of course, you'd be asserting your certain needs, but you'd also be assertive in suggesting to the other person that they work together to sort this out. And of course, you're being very cooperative because the end result of collaboration is that you're going to get a result that both parties are happy with. And so the big downfall, of course, of that style of conflict resolution is that it takes time, because it basically means that you've got to talk to the person probably several times until you can come to a resolution that you can both be happy with. So whilst it may look like the supreme way of dealing with conflict, it's not always practical in our busy world, because we're all running around doing lots of things, and sometimes we just don't have time to collaborate. And so in the middle there, right smack bang in the middle, is compromise. And you might say, well, why is compromise in the middle? Well, when you compromise with someone, you've got to give and take. So that's why it's not highly assertive, because at some points you've got to make concessions. And at other times, of course, you're quite, you need to dig your heels in. And you might say, well, why isn't it fully cooperative? Surely when two people are compromising, it's highly cooperative. Well, it is in one sense, but in another sense, you don't get all that you set out to get. So when you compromise, you usually meet halfway. And a classic example of that, of course, is buying a house. Normally the seller has a price that they want, and the buyer has a different price, which is normally lower. And so sometimes, if it's a successful sale, then the seller and the buyer will meet halfway. So it's partially cooperative, but it's not totally cooperative. So that's why it's in the middle. So that's the model, and that's how it works. Have any of you got any questions about that? Excuse me. Okay, so let's have a look at this in a little bit more depth. Now, the point I want to make with the your profile is when you look at your scores, and what the profile does is it gives you 5 scores. And the idea is that your high scores, and when I say high, I'm saying relative to the other scores, will probably give you an idea of how you feel most comfortable dealing with conflict. So, for example, if you had a very high score in compromising comparable to the other scores, it might well be that you are always trying to compromise, and that's great when you're dealing with someone that wants to compromise, but what about when you're dealing with someone that doesn't? That's going to be problematic for you, because you're not going to get very far with that, because they don't want to compromise. So it's that the blind spot there for you is that you are putting too much energy into compromising in situations that would be better used in other ways. So you should be using other approaches as such. All right. So, and of course, the relatively low scores on your profile probably suggest that you could be using those a little bit more as a team leader in different situations. So the perfect scenario is to be able to use all 5 approaches. Now, let me give you an example of that so you understand what I'm talking about. So let's imagine that 2 people in your team are having a mild disagreement, and you're working in an open office environment and they're both having a mild disagreement. Now you think to yourself, well, I'll just let them sort it out, because they, I'm sure, can sort it out at the end. So your first strategy is to avoid, so that you decide not to do anything about it, because you're assuming, of course, that they will be able to sort out their own issue. But you notice that it gets louder and louder and a little more heated, and it gets to a stage where you think, I can't avoid this anymore. So you call those two people into your office and you ask each of them what's going on. And what you try and do in the second stage there is to compromise. So you're trying to look for some middle ground that both of those people would be happy with. But having talked about that for a little while, you find that both of them have got their arms crossed and their eyes crossed, and they refuse to compromise. So I've tried a second strategy and it hasn't worked. Then I might then say to them both, would you be willing to work with me to see if we can resolve this in another way that you'll both be happy with? So I'm now going to try a strategy of collaboration. And let's say that they feel so sort of set in their ways about the issues that they believe in, we're not going to get anywhere there. So what I might do then is I might say, because I'm the team leader, I might say, okay, well, this is what's going to happen. I want this to happen and this to happen and this to happen. So I'm now being quite competitive. I'm basically using my position to dictate what needs to be happening. So I'm now competing. So I've actually gone through 4 strategies in dealing with this conflict. 1, avoiding; 2, compromising; 3, collaboration; and 4, competing. So the chances of me resolving that issue has certainly gone up because of my preparedness to use more than one particular strategy. So hopefully you can see what I'm getting at there. All right, so let's look at competing to start with, and I just want to give a little bit more of an overview about each, and then we'll give you some cases to see if you can work through and sort out. Okay, so when should you use competing? Well, I think a good opportunity to use competing is when speed and decisiveness are necessary. So we're all working in a world where we're deadline driven, we've got things to do, we've got opportunities that will pass if we don't make decisions. So in those sorts of circumstances where you don't have the luxury of time for discussion, then it's probably fair and reasonable for you to compete. In other words, just to make the decision without consulting people. Now, if you do that every now and again, of course, it won't be a problem because people understand that that's part of what you do as a team leader. Of course, if you use it too often, then people will say that you're not being consultative. But certainly when there's not time to discuss things, it's perfectly reasonable for you to compete. Another time, and the little example I gave you before is one of those where if the parties are refusing to cooperate with you, or they're actually trying to take advantage of your goodwill, then it would be fair and reasonable for you to put your foot down. Because in those sort of circumstances, people are actually taking advantage of you. And of course, you don't have to be hostile about it, but you might be quite assertive and let the person know that that's not going to happen, or I don't agree with you, or whatever. Another time when you'd use this is when you have unpopular decisions to make in a team. Now, when we have unpopular decisions to make, and inevitably we do, there's no point in trying to sugarcoat it because that's actually just going to increase the resentment. I think the best thing to do is just to make the decision and explain to people, even if you must, that it's not a popular decision, but it has to be made. So in those cases, I think it's just best to make the decisions and let people know that you need to make the decision and there's no winners out of it, and I just need to make that decision. So there's 3 examples where you'd use competing. So let's go to the next one, which is accommodating. Now remember, accommodating, as you can see on your chart, is adjacent or opposite to that. So it's over on the bottom right-hand corner. So when would you use accommodating? Okay, let's have a look. So one of the cases where the relationship is more important than the issue. Now what do I mean by that? So this is a person who feels very strongly about their issue, and you aren't all that concerned about it, but you believe that by digging your heels in, it's going to create a problem with that person. So you decide to let them have it their own way. And so, of course, as I said before, in personal relationships, we do this all the time. And in work-related situations, say for example, somebody needed a little bit of flexibility and they needed a little bit of time off because they had to go in, their child was having difficulty at school, they had to go in for a parent-teacher interview, and it's not very convenient for you, inevitably, but you think to yourself, well, if I prevent this from happening, I'm probably going to cause a bit of damage in our own working relationship. So even though it's inconvenient, I'll allow that person to take that time off, and I'm hoping, of course, that will be repaid in terms of that person's goodwill. So that would be an example, of course. Another example might be where you're in a case where you're not going to get your needs met. So ultimately, you've got a bit of you've got a bit of political awareness about you. You know you're not going to win this battle, so you're better off just conceding and letting the other person win, because by just digging your heels in, you're just going to create more of a problem. So in those cases, it's best just to let go and let the other person have it their way. And of course, if it's not very important, then who cares? So, the old adage of picking your battles, at the end of the day, you can't get involved in every bun fight around the workplace. So at the end of the day, it might just be best just to let go, because frankly, it's not very important to you, and you could probably be spending your energies elsewhere. Now, avoiding might seem like the least effective of the 5 approaches, but actually avoiding can be very useful in certain circumstances. For example, you're at a team meeting and somebody says something that's inaccurate, but that's not the point of the meeting. They've just made a statement that's inaccurate. And of course, you might feel tempted to correct them, but frankly, there's no need to do that, because you're going to achieve the result that you want anyway. So you decide to close your mouth and not correct them, because you think to yourself, well, if I correct them, even though I'm right, this could take us off on a tangent that I really don't want to go down. So we decide not to say anything. And of course, that's probably the best course of action, particularly if you're going to get what you need from the situation, the meeting. Or, of course, a better time might be where somebody's a little bit heated, or they're not thinking straight, they're not being rational. So what we might do then is you might just delay the decision until a better time might emerge. Or a customer or a client or a stakeholder asks you a question on the run, you really don't have the answer. And for you to try and answer something to give inaccurate information could be quite damaging. So you actually say to the other person, leave it with me, I'll check it out and I'll get back to you at another time. So you can see, by doing that, you're buying yourself an opportunity to learn more about the circumstances before you react. So that doesn't mean a fob off. You still get back to them once you've got your information and you know what you're doing. So that would be a case where I would avoid initially, to give myself more scope and opportunity to learn more, and then come back to them at another stage. Another opportunity or another case where you would avoid is obviously if the relationship or the issue isn't particularly important to you. Then, as I said earlier, you can only involve yourself in so many bun fights around the workplace. So my suggestion there is just let it go. There's absolutely no point in you getting involved. There's no upside of that. So you avoid it. And of course, team leaders have to be very selective about what we involve ourselves in the workplace. And finally, as I said earlier, if you need to know more, then don't feel pressured to give an answer. So someone might put you on the spot at one of your team meetings, and you really think to yourself, I'm being a bit blindsided here. It's quite easy then for you to say, leave it with me, I need to check that out, and I'll get back to you at an appropriate time. So that way you've avoided it at the time, You've gone to do your homework, and then you can come back with a different perspective. Now, as I said earlier, collaboration is high on assertion and high on cooperativeness, so we could probably imagine that it would be the ideal approach to deal with any conflict in a team. Problem is, of course, it takes time. So let's have a look at when you would use it. In situations where the issue at stake is important and the relationships are important, then this would be a perfect time to collaborate. So really, because it requires maintaining a relationship and solving an issue, it might well be the right way to go in those circumstances. Another case is where the outcome needs to satisfy both parties. So you've got two people in this, and frankly, you must get a result that both parties are happy with. Why? Well, because maybe if you don't, then it could cause problems. Now, I'll give you an example of that. You're a team leader and you've got another team in the organization you're dealing with, and you work closely with that team. Now, in order to get a resolution to a problem, you may need to collaborate because, frankly, you need their cooperation going forward and they need your cooperation. So you and the other team leader might get your heads together and try and work out a resolution where both teams are going to be happy. And that'll require you talking to the other person, of course, and working your way through that. Another case might be where all parties are committed to a solution. So this, if you and another party, whether it's a client or stakeholder or whoever it might be, if you're both committed to resolving the problem, then obviously a collaboration is going to be a good way to go because there's motivation there. But if the other party's not interested in resolving it, then obviously collaborating is not going to work. In fact, it's going to be a bit of a waste of time. And sometimes when you collaborate with people, you actually get a better result. You get a better result because you've actually talked it through and come up with a creative solution that would not necessarily have emerged had you not sat down and discussed it. So, you know, collaboration can produce great results in the end. So compromising, and I think, you know, when we look at and everybody in this Lunch and Learn today is from an Australian organisation. I think in our culture here, compromising is considered to be an acceptable way of dealing with conflict. But of course, it's not the only way, and I think that's the important point I want to make today. So you can, when you're compromising, it can be useful when you're running out of time. So if you've been trying to collaborate, but there's a deadline looming, such as this afternoon at the close of business, it might well be that you have to cut your losses and the other party has to think about it as well. So you come up with some concessions that you're willing to make and the other party be willing to do the same thing in the interests of meeting a deadline, which is critically important to honour. So that would be an example where you might compromise. As I just indicated, when you're trying to collaborate and if you use collaboration and competing and you've found that those two aren't working or haven't worked, then you can switch to collaboration. And provided there's a motivation from the other person, you can switch to compromise. And provided there's some sense of motivation to resolving it, and they're willing to make some concessions, that is the other person, and you're willing to make some concessions, then it's quite possible for you to compromise in that situation. Sometimes it can be used as a temporary measure. So you might decide that because we've got a looming deadline, how about we make some sort of a compromise, and once we've got through this, we'll get our heads together again and come up with a better way forward, which we're both happy with. But in the interest of time, perhaps we need to just make some concessions, both of us, before we, meet the deadline. And sometimes compromise is the only way. And as I said earlier, that there is a cultural view, I think, that compromise is an acceptable way or probably the most acceptable way of dealing with conflict, but it's not always the best way, and that's my key point here. So have any of you got any insights, questions, comments, observations about any of those 5 approaches? I'm more than happy to take on board a comment, question, or whatever. Okay, while you might be thinking about that, I'm not going to run through this very busy slide. You'll receive all these, but the point I want to make is that there are advantages and disadvantages of each particular style. So, to suggest that one is better than the others is erroneous, because they're not. Each situation needs to be looked at. There are 3 key variables in every single situation you're dealing with in conflict. There is your own personal style, and of course that's what the conflict questionnaire was all about. There is the style of the other party, which may be an individual or group of people, so they obviously have their own way of wanting to deal with conflict as well. So those 2 things, you obviously can't give them a questionnaire to do, but they do have their own approach and style. And then the third thing, of course, is the situation that you're in. And the situation you're in requires you to think about which of these 5 might be the appropriate way to go. Now, of course, none of us are quick enough, smart enough to go through all that in a short space of time. So my point is, if plan A doesn't work, then you try plan B. Or if plan B doesn't work, you try plan C. So the whole objective here is to be as flexible as you possibly can when you're dealing with conflict. Okay. So let's look at some case studies now. Let's look at some things. Now, I'm going to ask you to do this. I want you to actually participate in this. I would like you to type in the word, the style that you think is most appropriate for dealing with each of these situations. Bearing in mind, I've only given you limited amount of information. Now, I'll read them out to you. And when I've read them out to you, or during that time, I want you to think, would I compete? Would I accommodate? Would I avoid? Would I collaborate? Or would I compromise in that circumstance? So I've kept them fairly generic. So let's go through and have a look at the first one. So the first one is this. A customer calls you. All right. So, they've got a good working relationship with you, and they call you and they want you to handle an order for them. Now, if you're a consultant and it's a client, same sort of deal. But you no longer work in that team. Now, they don't know that, of course, but you no longer work in that team, and it would create a major problem internally if you cross departments. Okay, so if you took this job on, obviously the customer would be pleased, but once you brought the work back, it might cause a serious problem internally. But here's the crunch. The customer who orders a moderate amount of product from your organization has been very insistent with you. So they're digging their heels in, and they want you to deal with this, even though others, may be better placed. Now, I've just got a couple of comments here. Tom says, collaborate. Has anyone else got a view about that? Good. Anyone else? Toby would accommodate. Now, can I just deal with that, Toby? If you accommodated in that circumstance, you would obviously please them, and then you'd have a problem internally. So you'd have a situation where you'd cause yourself some problems and grief internally, and that might be a problem for you down the track. The other thing that would also do, Toby, is it would create a situation where they would keep coming back to you, wouldn't they? So you wouldn't actually be able to, it would create a problem. So I'm not sure that would work. Anthony says collaborate, both sides are important. Okay, nicely put, Anthony. So you're thinking about the whole arrangement and understanding that there needs to be a resolution from both ends. Excellent. Good. Anyone else want to have a go? Because it's always interesting to see what people would think in these circumstances. While you might be typing in your message, let's have a look at what you perhaps wouldn't do. Now, obviously you can't avoid that because, I mean, really, how can you avoid it? I mean, you've got to deal with it. So that avoiding is out. I think you'd all agree. Vanessa says, I'd collaborate as well and communicate with all parties involved. Yeah, I think that's a good answer, Vanessa. So competing is probably not a very good idea either. I probably wouldn't say to the customer or the client, look, I no longer deal with that and you need to talk to X. That's probably not a great idea, whether a public sector or private sector, not good. So accommodation, and I notice that, we've talked about that, accommodation creates a rod for your own back in the sense that that person continues to come back to you, even though it's inconvenient for you internally. So that's probably not a long-term solution. It could well be, you can certainly make that a short-term, but I think you're creating a problem for yourself. I agree with those that talk about collaboration. I think what I might do, and I think this might be what you're saying, I would probably say to the customer, look, I'm no longer in that team, but I'm more than happy to make an introduction to the other team leader so that you can talk to them directly about that. It'll work much better in your favour because they are the ones that are dealing with that right now. But I realise you don't know who they are, and I'm more than happy to make that connection for you. How does that sound? So I think that's the sort of way I might go about that one. So really I'm pleasing the customer and I'm pleasing my internal stakeholders as well. So I think, I think as Anthony said, both sides are important. All right, let's move on to the next one. You got the idea now. I want you to type in what you would do in these circumstances. So let's read through it. This is a personal one. You've had your car in for repair, and unfortunately that's what's happening to me right now. You've had your car in for repair, and although they claim it's fixed, you have the same problem. So you've collected your car, it's not a regular fault, and it's fairly obvious, so like a noise under the bonnet or something. You've paid your bill, and when you've collected the car, and you're not prepared to pay any more, which is fair enough. Now, they are the only dealer that is at all convenient for you, and but you want your car fixed properly now. So do you compete? Do you accommodate? Do you avoid? Do you compromise? Or do you collaborate? Type in what you would do in those circumstances. And their circumstances, I think we've all probably experienced at certain times. So what would you do? What sort of things would you do in that case? Just give you a moment to type in your answer. Okay, Tom says compete. I'll address that in a minute. Vanessa says compete, I think. Okay, anyone else? All right, well, okay, just while other people are typing their responses in, let's have a look at what you wouldn't do. Now, you can't really avoid it, can you? Collaborate, says Jeff. Let's have a look. It depends on the dealer's position on the issue, says Tom. Yeah, look, there's a lot of things, Tom, that are not said in these, and you've got to take all those things into consideration. But at the end of the day, you couldn't avoid it, could you? Because obviously you want your car back now and it's inconvenient, as I do. That's another story. I won't burden you with that. I don't think it's a good idea to accommodate because, frankly, you've paid your money, you believe you're in the right, and you're not willing to pay any more. So you're in that very difficult position. So I don't really think accommodation is appropriate. So it really only leaves three possibilities. So what I might do, I think, is I would compete, not aggressively, of course, that's not the point, but I would just be firm about it and point out that I've paid my money. It's the same fault, and I'd like them to fix it, please. Now, make it very clear and be firm. Now, I don't know whether that's going to work, but what I believe is the right thing to do. Now, if it doesn't work, and I think this is what you're saying, Jeff, if that doesn't work for whatever reason, then of course the fallback position could be to collaborate. But I think in the first instance, I'd probably compete. I could collaborate, but I think maybe competing is the right way in the first circumstance because, frankly, you're in the right. And that's the important point here, that it's not a complex issue, but it's very obvious to you. All right, situation number 3. Let's have a look at that. Again, type in your responses to how you might deal with it. So you're a manager of a team that currently uses a manual recording system, and your analysis shows greater productivity if it's automated. Susan Jones runs the same operation in another team. She disagrees with your proposition, citing customer concerns and employee resistance, plus technical problems with the system you are proposing. But your manager's told you that you've got to resolve the situation with Susan because you both must run the same way. So are you going to compete? Are you going to avoid? Are you going to accommodate? Are you going to compromise? Or are you going to collaborate? Just type in your responses there. Let's see what we come up with there. So this is a little bit more complex and it involves a few more people. What are you going to do? How might you deal with that one? Maybe while you're thinking about that, a couple of clues about that. You're on equal terms or equal footing with Susan. It's not as if one has more say than the other. Compromise, says Vanessa. The fact is that the manager's asked you to sort it out, so you've got to sort it out. So you're in that situation where you must sort it out. I believe you would feel as strongly about your argument as Susan would feel about hers, so there's going to be a strong view about that. Tom says collaborate, then possibly compromise. Yeah, good, Tom. I think you're getting a good handle on this. I think what I would do, well, let's look at what you wouldn't do. You can't avoid it because obviously, it has to be dealt with. It's probably not a good idea to accommodate because the reality is your idea might be better than hers. So frankly, you're doing no one a favour by just rolling over. I could try to compete, but the reality is that person's got as much say in this issue as I have, so the chances of me getting my way by competing are probably very limited because Susan feels very strongly about her view of the world. So really I'm left with compromise or collaborate. Now, I think it's probably more likely to be a collaboration than a compromise in the sense that it's either automated or it's not. You can't sort of have half and half. So I might actually say to Susan, how about we give it a trial? How about we use your system for a week, if it's possible, of course. And then how about we use my system for a week? How about we get our teams together and then we can make a decision about which is the best way forward. I think that's probably what I'd try and do in those circumstances. All right, situation 4. This is a doozy. I'll be interested to hear your response. But here it is. Your boss has a personal dislike for one of your team and is insisting on you firing that person or not renewing their contract. Whilst you recognise some occasional problems, you can manage that quite easily, and the person is in fact important to the team. So, you've got that sort of situation you've got to deal with, which is probably not terribly good. What do you do? Do you compete? Do you avoid? Do you accommodate? Do you compromise, or do you collaborate? Just type in your response and we'll see how we go. So let's have a look. Okay, let's see. What would you do? So you've got a boss who doesn't like one of your team members. Um, you see some value in them, even though you probably understand that they're not the easiest person to get on with, so you can see both sides of that. They've asked you not to renew the contract. What do you do? Look, let's see. What do people think? Let's look at what you wouldn't do. Okay, what have we got here? Tom says, if the boss is insisting, then you will have to compete. Okay, so in other words, yeah, I can see what your point is there, Tom. It's really interesting because you could use a number of different approaches here. I could actually avoid this. Now, we could be driving back from a client or something and they make this comment. I don't know whether they're serious or not. Maybe they've just had a bad day. So I just ignore it. And if it comes up again, I think this is what Tom's alluding to, I can get on and deal with it. So that might be a possibility. Now, of course, at the end of the day, this is a personal issue. And of course, if you accommodate, you will have a lot of problems with your team because the team will think rightly, when my back's turned, what are you going to do? So they're going to be a bit upset, aren't they? Because, you're not looking after your troops, so to speak. I think, so I can see competing would work. I can see avoiding would work. And obviously, if it comes to the crunch, you could collaborate, as in, moving the person out of sight, out of mind, or whatever. But at the end of the day, I think the important thing is it's a personal issue. All right, one more and then we're done. So we have a situation where as a manager, you want to design a new system in a way that suits you. Your approach at the manager's meeting is to raise it with the other managers who are all affected by the proposed new system. One of the other managers says it's too costly that way and that each manager should simply offer their approach and the general manager make the decision. So they're actually, someone in the meeting says, oh, look, why don't we just bump it upstairs? Okay, let the general manager make the decision. Now, you've got a slightly different view, all right? So how do you deal with that? So, because that's very common, isn't it? So anyone got any suggestions? How might you deal with a problem where somebody in your team or somebody in this team, this management team, is saying, look, let's not discuss it. Let's just pass it straight up to the general manager. He or she can make the decision and enough is enough. So how do you deal with that? Do you compromise? Do you collaborate? Do you avoid? Do you compete? How do you do that? What do you do in that situation? Well, let's look at some of the things you wouldn't do. You can't avoid it, obviously. You shouldn't necessarily accommodate because you believe that all of them should work together to try to come up with a resolution. So that's probably not a good idea. You may actually say to that other person something along the lines of this, and this would be a compromise. You might actually say, look, why don't we try and discuss this, come up with a resolution, and if we're happy with that, if we can do that, then great, and if we can't, then let the general manager sort it out. Start competing and then compromise. Okay, so Anthony's, so try and I can see what you're saying, Anthony. Push your point. And if it doesn't work, then you can always back down or make concessions. So I think I understand where you're going with that. All right, so folks, we're just about out of time, so let's just move on. Look, there's a key point out of today, and that is you need to be flexible. Don't overuse your preferred style from your profile. And if plan A doesn't work, there's always a plan B. So that's my key message out of today. So your homework, obviously, is to go away and just be a little bit more flexible and a bit more mindful about how you might deal with negotiations and conflicts in your team. And that's about it from me. So next time we meet, we're going to be going into looking at developing team culture. So I look forward to working with you in that case there. So folks, that's about it. So thank you again. Thank you for your participation today. It's always great to have people participating online, because of course I'm just talking to a screen, aren't I, which isn't ideal. So thanks everyone, and even though it's Thursday, have a wonderful weekend and rest of the day, and we'll catch up in 2 weeks. Thank you and goodbye.